We are not able to take care of her. That was what my children told the discharge nurse. I was still in the wheelchair, staring straight ahead. Exactly 1 hour later, CBS New York aired a breaking segment. Decorated Colonel Grace Gallagher awarded $8.8 million and a private beach estate. That evening they came rushing to my door, holding flowers and fake apologies. But it was already too late. Because I had done something they never saw coming. And the world had already seen what kind of children I raised. They said it with straight faces, no hesitation, no shame. We are not able to take care of her. That was the line my son delivered, standing just outside the rehab unit, where I had spent 3 months relearning how to dress myself, how to eat with trembling fingers, how to move forward in a world where my spine would never fully recover. I was there when they said it. Still in the wheelchair, still weak from weeks of physical therapy and painkillers. They did not even wait until I was out of earshot. My daughter folded her arms. My son kept checking his phone. They looked at me like I was a billing issue, not a person, not their mother. The nurse glanced over at me, her eyes soft with something between sympathy and fury. She asked if they needed help coordinating in-home support. My daughter shook her head. My son muttered something about busy work schedules and his HOA meetings. We're not set up for full-time care, he added. It wouldn't be safe. For whom, I wonder? They left soon after that, with the discharge paperwork unsigned. No hugs, no thank you, no see you soons, just the sound of car keys and a quick exit. But I didn't cry, not in front of them. I asked to be wheeled back to my room and I sat there, under the soft hospital light, as the nurses quietly moved around me. I took out my phone, opened the app, and replayed the footage. The audio was clear, the tone undeniable. This wasn't the first time I had been made to feel invisible, but this was the first time I had proof. Exactly 61 minutes later, CBS New York ran the segment. Decorated war veteran Grace Gallagher receives full military compensation. Colonel Gallagher, now 73, honored for 25 years of service and a final mission in hostile territory. The Department of Defense confirms a long-delayed compensation package totaling $8.8 million in structured payments, along with a fully deeded coastal estate in Maine. That was my name, they said. My face on the screen. And suddenly everything changed. I don't know who told them. My son's voicemail came in first, then a text from my daughter, then an email with the subject line, "We need to talk." By sunset, they were at my house. I had not given them the address. They brought flowers, cheap supermarket bouquets that still had the price tags on the plastic wrap. They wore nice coats, hair brushed, voices soft. "Mum, we're so sorry. We didn't know. We were confused. We thought you needed space." That part almost made me laugh. Space. What I needed was for my children to act like I mattered when I had nothing in my name, but a drawer full of service medals and a stack of unpaid hospital bills. They asked if they could come inside. I stayed in my chair on the porch, a warm blanket across my lap, my coffee cooling beside me. I told them to sit on the steps if they needed to rest. The door behind me stayed shut. The thing about people like them is that they do not expect consequences. They think time erases betrayal, that if they smile and tilt their heads just right, the past becomes negotiable. But not this time, because I had already done the thing they would never expect. And soon, they would understand just how much that would cost them. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever been looked at, like you were an inconvenience to your own family, you know the kind of stillness I felt. It's the kind that comes before a storm, the kind that doesn't scream, it sharpens. That night, I made a phone call to Jonathan Hale, estate attorney. We had met months ago through a referral. I told him the documents were ready to be executed. No changes, no adjustments, no hesitation. I also forwarded him the video clip from the rehab center. I told him I had full release to use it however he saw fit. The next morning, my face was on 3 more news channels. I didn't say much, just a few words about dignity, about service, about being discarded too soon. The world watched. But my children, they watched closer, and they started to realize something. The mother they had underestimated was no longer the woman who raised them. She had become someone else entirely, someone they could no longer control, someone they should have never left behind. The morning after the news broke, my front porch was quiet again. No footsteps on the gravel, no urgent knocking, just the sound of the wind rolling in from the east, carrying with it the smell of salt and cedar. The kind of morning you could mistake for peace if you weren't paying attention. But I wasn't at peace. I was focused. I spent 2 hours on the phone, not with my children, not with neighbors. First was the call to the Department of Veterans Affairs. My discharge classification had been upgraded months ago. The benefits package was already approved. All I needed was to finalize where the checks would be sent and which account to attach for the real estate transfer. The property in Maine had been under federal hold, waiting for someone with my clearance level and history of service. Apparently, I was the only surviving candidate in my category. Next was the legal firm. Jonathan Hale was efficient. By the time I hung up, he had already drawn up the codicils. The original will, which had split my estate between my 2 children, was now null, replaced by a detailed, ironclad arrangement. My entire estate would go to the Whitmore Fund for Female Veterans, a program I had helped found but never thought I'd need. I gave him full permission to proceed. He didn't ask if I was sure. He already knew. That afternoon, I reviewed every document from my hospital stay, every bill, every signature my daughter had forged to access my insurance account, every online transaction where my son had rerouted federal notices to his own email. They were small things, spaced out over years, but they painted a clear picture. This wasn't neglect. This was strategy. They had seen me as a structure, a system, an asset that could be used, drained, then discarded once it became too high maintenance. They were about to learn what it meant to underestimate a woman who had navigated hostile territory and congressional briefings in the same week. I called an old contact from my service days, a journalist now working as an independent media consultant. I sent her copies of the documents, the rehab footage, and my attorney's summary. She called back 30 minutes later, breathless. "You're not just a story," she said. "You're a warning." I told her she could use whatever she needed under one condition. The piece had to focus not on me, but on what happens when people mistake silence for surrender. She agreed. Within 48 hours, 3 national outlets picked it up. The title was clear: Decorated Colonel Discarded by Her Own Children. That's all it took. Suddenly my phone wasn't silent anymore. Reporters, radio shows, producers from networks I hadn't watched in years. I didn't say yes to most. I didn't need to. The story was moving with or without me. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hale filed the new will publicly, attaching the footage and financial records as part of a public statement of intent. There was nothing my children could contest, nothing to argue. It was all legal, witnessed, and dated. Ironclad. I received a cease and desist letter from my son's lawyer 2 days later. Something about slander and emotional damage. I forwarded it to Hale. He sent back a 1-line response. Let him sue. Discovery will be fun. I smiled at that. By the end of the week, the Whitmore Fund was trending. Donations flooded in. Letters from other veterans, especially women, poured into my mailbox. I read every one. Some were heartbreaking, some were angry. All of them reminded me why I had to follow through. Because this wasn't just about revenge, it was about reminding the world that those who build nations should not be thrown aside by the ones they built homes for. On Friday, I drove myself to the local courthouse. My physical therapist had helped me adapt my car with hand controls. I filed a formal restraining order against both of my children. Not out of spite, out of caution. The attention made them unpredictable. I wasn't going to be caught unaware again. As I stepped out of the courthouse, an older woman approached me, maybe in her late 60s, maybe more. She didn't introduce herself. She just touched my shoulder and said thank you. That night, I sat in my study. The documents were filed, the signatures finalized, the transfer of funds in motion, the home in Maine being prepared. And I was no longer afraid of being alone. Because alone doesn't mean powerless. It just means nobody's standing in your way. I poured myself a glass of water, opened the window, and let the night air in. It didn't feel like a war anymore. It felt like the beginning of something better. 3 days after the new will was filed and the story aired nationally, I got a call from CBS New York. They wanted a second interview. This time, not at my home, but at their studio. The producer said their inbox had been flooded with messages. Viewers wanted to know more, not just about my service, but about the decision to cut off my children entirely. They didn't want inspiration. They wanted truth. I said yes. They sent a car. The driver shook my hand and opened the door with the kind of respect you don't often see anymore. I could tell he knew who I was, but he didn't say it out loud. I appreciated that. At the studio, everything moved quickly. Hair, mic, lights, cue cards. The host, a young man named Marcus, asked if I was nervous. I told him no. When you've been shot at in a foreign desert, a camera isn't much of a threat. We went live at 6 p.m. The segment opened with clips from my military career, a few shots from the ceremony in DC, then the footage, the one from the rehab center, the hallway camera, the voices clear. We are not able to take care of her. I sat quietly as it played. On the screen, my son looked down at his phone while my daughter kept her arms crossed. The nurse's voice, gentle but confused. My chair in the background, I never moved. That was the part that caught people's attention. Not the words, the silence. Marcus turned to me and asked what went through my mind during that moment. I said I realized my children had mistaken kindness for weakness for too long, and I was done pretending not to notice. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I just let the clip speak for itself. Then I looked straight into the camera and said I changed my will not to punish them, but to correct myself. I had spent too many years assuming love was unconditional. Turns out, conditions show up fast when money and inconvenience enter the room. The interview ended. The crew clapped quietly. Marcus squeezed my hand. By the time I got home, the footage was already online. Within the next 6 hours, it hit 2 million views. The video wasn't flashy. No dramatic music, no spinning headlines. Just one woman, seated, steady, saying what most people in her place had never had the chance to say out loud. The public response was immediate. Military families messaged the station. Women wrote in to say they saw their own mothers in my story. Sons and daughters emailed to apologize for how they had treated their own aging parents. None of it was my goal, but it confirmed I had done the right thing. 2 days later, another clip surfaced. It wasn't mine. It was an older video, posted years ago, of my daughter joking about her inheritance during a wine night with friends. Someone had recorded it. She laughed about my pension, about the idea of not needing to work once I was gone. She described me as strong in public, but brittle in private. The tone was mocking. Light, but sharp. It spread quickly. Another came next. This time, my son. He was giving a talk at a networking event. He had slipped in a line about caring for an elderly parent being a financial hazard. The audience chuckled. So did he. But when that video resurfaced next to mine, it wasn't funny anymore. People started asking questions, not just the public. Sponsors, employers, clients. A reporter from a veterans journal called me to confirm details. She said the background checks on my children were spiking. People were digging into campaign donations, charity involvement, public grant filings. I told her I had nothing else to say, but the story didn't stop. A week after the broadcast, Hale forwarded me a notice. A formal inquiry had been opened into potential misuse of power of attorney during my surgery recovery period. The hospital had flagged inconsistencies in their billing system tied to my name. Multiple attempts to authorize financial documents without proper signature. Timing aligned with my stay in the ICU. The investigation was real now. My children didn't call again, but they responded the only way they knew how. They went online. First, a joint statement posted to my daughter's social media. It was polished, professionally written. They claimed regret. They said things had been misrepresented, that family was complicated, that forgiveness was a journey. It didn't land well. People flooded the comments, screenshots of past statements, clips from the videos, quotes from my interview. The internet was not interested in forgiveness for people who had never apologized directly. Then came the emails. Not to me. To the Whitmore Fund, a few donors wanted to confirm the story was real. The team replied with links, legal documents, interviews, military records. Everything was in order. Donations doubled that week. And suddenly the story shifted again. No longer just about betrayal. It became about something larger, a woman who reclaimed her voice, who refused to reward cruelty with silence, who used the system the way the system had once used her. By the end of the second week, Hale finalized the asset shift. All retirement funds locked into the trust. The home in Arlington listed for transition. The main estate officially transferred to my name. It was done. And my children could do nothing but watch from behind screens that no longer gave them control. That night, I didn't celebrate. I opened my old footlocker. Inside were letters from deployments, photos from training camps, badges I had earned in places that no longer existed on a map. I laid them out on my desk, one by one. Then I opened the drawer where I had once kept the original will. Empty now, but not lost, rewritten, reclaimed, and for the first time in a very long time, truly mine. The week following the second interview felt different. The house was quieter, but not in a lonely way. It was the kind of quiet that arrives when you've turned the last page of something that once drained you. I was finally watching the storm settle, but the winds outside hadn't stopped. Not for them. By Monday morning, the first wave of consequences rolled in. My daughter's employer released a statement distancing themselves from her. They cited conflict of values and public backlash. The phrasing was clinical, but the meaning was crystal clear. She had become a liability. She had taken her private disdain and turned it into a public disgrace, and no company that relied on image wanted anything to do with that. I didn't find out through her. I found out through my attorney, Jonathan Hale. His firm had been monitoring all public developments for potential litigation risks. Not for me, but to prepare for what they might try to throw back. But nothing came from their side. Not a word. No calls, no messages, just silence and fallout. The next day, it was my son's turn. He had been serving on the board of a local non-profit focused on elder wellness. The organization issued a notice removing him from the board, effective immediately. They thanked him for his time and effort, but made it known that they could, in good faith, retain anyone involved in what they called a betrayal of the elderly and infirm. His name was scrubbed from the website within hours. His LinkedIn account went private. His professional profile vanished like it had never existed. More messages came to the Whitmore Fund. Donations continued, but so did stories. Other elderly parents, veterans, estranged families, people who had quietly endured what I endured, now choosing to speak up because someone had gone first. Then the legal letters started arriving. The Office of the Attorney General of the state notified my legal team of a preliminary inquiry into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It was based on the flagged hospital activity. Records showed multiple access attempts to my medical proxy portal during the time I was unconscious. Emails traced to my son's IP address. 2 withdrawal attempts, stopped only because the bank required live voice verification. My daughter had authorized a secondary caregiver form for me without notarization. The document was rejected, but the system logged it. The name used was hers, but the handwriting on the scan wasn't. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Jonathan Hale advised I remain quiet while it unfolded. I agreed. There was no need to chase anything. The damage had already been done, and they had done it to themselves. One evening, while sorting mail on my dining table, I found an envelope addressed by hand. No return address. Inside was a folded printout of a GoFundMe campaign. The title said it all. Help rebuild after family fallout. The photo was my daughter, hairstyled, makeup perfect, eyes misty. The description framed her as a misunderstood child caught in a viral storm. She described me as distant, cold, too proud to allow help. Said the inheritance story had been twisted by the media. I didn't respond. 3 days later, the platform took the page down for violating their terms. It was hard to keep track of how many ways they tried to spin the story. From carefully written public statements to quiet emails behind the scenes, they cycled through every stage of damage control. But none of it landed. Because what they didn't understand was that this wasn't just a story anymore. This had become a reckoning. People were watching not because I had been wronged, but because they had seen what it looked like when someone actually did something about it. They weren't following a scandal. They were following a shift. The final blow came from the bank. A letter to my son. Denial of his request to refinance his home. Reason: unstable financial reputation, pending legal inquiry, and public character concerns. Jonathan obtained a copy. It was clean and sharp, without room for debate. He called it the end of the rope. And it was. For years they had operated in shadows, quiet digs, subtle manipulations, passive threats, always just under the radar, always careful enough to seem like nothing serious. But now, every word, every email, every unkind comment had a mirror, a digital paper trail, and the world was paying attention. In the meantime, the main property was finalized. I received the keys in a leather-bound folder. The house was pristine, white siding, wide porch, ocean air that smelled like freedom. I hadn't walked inside yet, but I had already decided that when I did, it would be on my terms. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, holding the folder in my lap. Not long ago, that bed had felt like a prison. I had laid in it with bruised ribs, a weakened spine, and the crushing weight of being discarded. Now it felt different, like a place of power, like somewhere I had earned the right to rest. I didn't want revenge, not in the way people think of it. I wanted recognition. I wanted the truth to stand on its own legs, even if mine couldn't anymore. And it had. The fallout wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. No more whispers, No more fake smiles. No more pretending everything was fine while my dignity bled in silence. This time, they weren't the ones telling the story, and I wasn't the one being silenced. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a call. It wasn't even a lawyer. It was Brandon himself who showed up at my door. He didn't knock like a stranger. He knocked like a man who still believed he had a key, a right, a reason to be let in. It was a firm knock, followed by silence, then two more like punctuation. I didn't open immediately. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, letting the knock echo through the house. Then I walked to the door and opened it. He looked older than I remembered. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was the tightness around his mouth or the thinness in his eyes. Or maybe I had changed more than I thought, and now I could see him without the filter of hope. "Hi, Mum." That's all he said. No apology, no question. Just those two words, like everything that had happened was somehow suspended. I stepped back and let him in. The air inside shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. Not because I was afraid, but because I had waited too long for this moment to not feel the weight of it settle into the walls. He looked around the house, at the new paint, the shelves of books, the framed photos I had put back up after years of hiding them. He didn't comment. He just stood, quiet, before finally sitting on the edge of the chair across from mine. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the fund, the fallout, the letters. He didn't bring up the GoFundMe page or the CBS interviews or the subpoena from the state attorney. He only said one thing. "You humiliated us." It wasn't anger. It was something colder, like betrayal dressed up as dignity. I nodded once, and you abandoned me. He blinked, but he didn't flinch. His expression was tight, like he hadn't expected me to respond that directly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let emotion crack through the seams. I stayed still, grounded. "You said you couldn't care for me. Those were your words." He looked down at his hands. They were clenched. "You said it in front of a nurse, in front of strangers, while I was in a wheelchair, with staples in my back and blood still under my fingernails. You said it, then left me." His eyes met mine. That was the first moment he looked like my son again. And that was the hardest part. Because that face was the same one I used to see running into the kitchen asking for pancakes. The same one that cried into my shoulder when his dog died. The same one that once said he'd never let anything bad happen to me. I let the silence stretch between us. "You made sure the world saw that part," he said. I didn't correct him. I didn't say that the world had already seen everything before I ever opened my mouth, that all I did was stop hiding it. He stood then, walking toward the fireplace where I had a small framed flag. It had been folded neatly from my retirement ceremony, set in a wooden triangle case. He picked it up, looked at it for a long moment. "You really think this changes anything?" "This is not revenge," I said. "This is restoration." He turned sharply. "You made us look like monsters. You did that yourself." His mouth opened like he had more to say, but then it closed again. I stood too, my spine still healing but steady. "You forgot who I was," I said. "You thought because I aged, because I slowed, because I was quiet, that I stopped being someone you had to respect. But I served this country for 25 years. I bled for it. I rebuilt myself in silence. And I gave you everything I had." He looked at me, not as a son looking at a mother, but as a man looking at someone he could no longer control. "I didn't write you out of my life. You did." And then I walked to the door and opened it again. He didn't move at first. "It's done," I said. "The estate is sealed. The fund is public. The truth is out. There is nothing more for you here." He took a slow breath, then set the folded flag back on the mantel. For a split second, I saw something break in him. Not remorse, not shame, something lonelier, like he realized he had bet against the wrong parent. He walked past me without a word, out into the late afternoon sun. I didn't close the door right away. I stood there, watching him walk down the path, his shoulders stiff, his steps uneven. When he reached the sidewalk, he paused. I thought he might turn around. He didn't. And that was the end of it. No yelling, no courtroom theatrics, just truth, spoken plainly, in the house he thought he still had a claim to. After I closed the door, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt clear. It was done. The confrontation had come. Not as fire, but as ice. Slow, cold, final. Not all victories are loud. Some are just quiet confirmations that you're no longer afraid. After the door closed behind Brandon, the silence inside the house felt heavier than before, but not in a painful way. It was the kind of silence that followed a storm. Not peace, not yet, but stillness. A space where nothing was spinning anymore. I sat in the armchair he had just vacated, not because it belonged to him, but because I wanted to understand what it felt like to be on that side of the room, facing the woman I had become, facing the walls that now held a new kind of memory, not of abandonment, but of reclamation. Outside, the sun had slipped behind the clouds. The breeze off the water carried the faint scent of salt and pine. I could hear the soft clinking of wind chimes from the back porch. They weren't fancy. I bought them from a roadside shop when I first moved in, long before anyone knew what I was really doing with the house. That evening, I made tea, not to soothe anything, but because my body still craved routine. I sat by the window with the cup in both hands and let my mind be still. Not numb, not racing, just still. There was a time I would have spent that night writing in journals, revisiting conversations, dissecting every word exchanged. But not now. Now, I had no desire to replay anything. The moment had passed, and it had done what it needed to do. In the days that followed, I did not speak to the press. I ignored every request for interviews, every message from local networks wanting a follow-up. The story had lived its life. Let them archive it. Let them move on. I began to return to the things that made me feel grounded. I walked the path near the dunes every morning. I started rebuilding the vegetable garden that had gone wild during the surgery months. I rejoined the veterans' circle, not for stories, but for stillness, for presence. One afternoon, during a quiet community potluck at the marina, a woman named Delilah handed me a small wrapped bundle of linen. Inside was a hand-carved wooden token etched with a quote I had once shared during a panel about resilience. I had forgotten I said it. She remembered. So did the others. "We heard what happened," she said quietly, not looking for a response. "You carried it with dignity. A lot of us. We saw ourselves in you." I thanked her, and meant it. That night, I took the token and placed it next to the folded flag on my mantel, not out of pride, but as a reminder that even when your own children can't see your worth, strangers often can. Weeks passed, then months. Letters from Brandon stopped. I had received 2. One was brief and cold. The second was longer, less polished. He spoke of confusion, of hurt, of not knowing where things had gone wrong. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't blame me. He just wrote. I didn't reply. Forgiveness wasn't something I could manufacture on paper. It had to grow in silence, like healing bone, like new skin after a burn. By autumn, the coastal winds turned sharp. I had the house insulated better. I fixed the porch railing. I brought in a few volunteers from the local youth centre to help organise the library of materials I had gathered for the Women's Veterans programme I was setting up. That programme, the one I used the public fund for, started slowly. Just a few attendees at first. Mostly women my age or older, some younger, all with their own scars. Some visible, some not. I wasn't trying to lead. I was just creating space. A space where no one had to explain why they were tired or why they didn't call their children anymore. A space where we could talk about grief without lowering our voices. On the 1-year mark of my discharge day, I sat alone by the beach just before sunrise. The air was crisp, the tide low. In my coat pocket was the discharge paper I had kept all this time, still folded, still creased from the moment I shoved it in there outside that hospital. I took it out, looked at the faded words, then placed it into the small fire I had started in a safe metal drum by the shore. The paper curled quickly, blackened, then lifted in ash. That was the last thing I burned. I no longer needed proof of what they did, of who I was. I had lived through it, and I had come out the other side not bitter, not broken, but whole. I wasn't healed entirely. That word still felt too clean. But I was healing. Actively, quietly, strongly. Some days, I missed the idea of a family that never really existed. Other days, I simply walked past it. Not out of coldness, but clarity. In that space between grief and peace, there was a kind of freedom I had never known before. Not the freedom to escape, but the freedom to stay and make this life, at last, entirely mine. By early spring, the program had a name. We called it Stand and Still, a place for women who had carried the weight of wars, abroad, at home, in silence. Not just soldiers, not just mothers. Women who had lost years inside roles no one ever fully acknowledged. It started as weekend workshops, small circles of conversation, some hesitant, others boiling over. I didn't speak much at first, I just listened. That was my role now, not to lead, not to preach, just to be there, solid, consistent. The funding I had redirected from the public grant made sure we had space. We rented a quiet building by the old pier, close enough to the coast that we could smell the salt, far enough that the breeze wasn't a distraction. One of the rooms became a small reading centre, another, a quiet meditation space. We didn't fill the walls with slogans or flags, just soft light, clean air, coffee, and time. Time was the rarest thing for these women. Time to speak without interruption, time to sit without being useful, time to cry without being told to be strong. One woman, Regina, used to sit at the back near the bookshelf. She had been a paramedic in 2 deployments, then came home to a family who treated her like a burden the moment she showed signs of PTSD. She didn't talk much for the first few weeks, but she kept coming back. One day she brought cookies. Another week she left a poem tucked under the coffee pot. Things grew slowly. Then all at once, a local news article picked up the story. Not about me, about the centre, about the women, about what it meant to finally have a place not shaped by charity, but by recognition. Not a shelter, a haven, a choice. That coverage brought letters, dozens of them, from women all over the state, some asking to join, some offering to volunteer, others just needing someone to know they existed. I read each one. Some late nights, I stayed behind after everyone left and ran my fingers across the names on the attendance list. I thought about where they had been, what they had survived, how they had ended up in this little room by the pier. Then I looked at my own name, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I belonged too. The shift in me didn't come loud. It came quietly, like how the body begins to trust sleep again after years of hypervigilance. At some point, I stopped bracing for Brandon's next move. I stopped scanning headlines to see if my family name had been dragged into something again. I stopped hoping for an apology. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed anyone, not them, not myself. What I did owe was this: to live forward, not from spite, but from clarity. The turning point came one afternoon when I stood outside the centre, hands deep in soil, planting spring bulbs with 2 new volunteers. One of them, a young girl named Frances, asked how I got the idea for Stand and Still. Her voice was casual, her eyes curious. And I said quietly, I built what I wish had existed when I came home. That was it. Not revenge, not pride, just presence, just purpose. Weeks later, a letter arrived, not from Brandon, from Rachel, his wife. It was brief and handwritten. She said she had left him, that she was living with her sister in Virginia. She didn't ask for anything. She just said she was sorry, and that she now understood what I had been trying to protect. I read it once, then placed it in a folder I kept tucked in a drawer with old photographs and discharge certificates. I didn't write back. Not yet. Not out of anger, but because some words needed time to settle, to prove they weren't just guilt wrapped in ink. Instead, I took that afternoon to visit the beach. I walked barefoot across the sand. Cold at first, then familiar. Somehow, walking away from pain without needing to be seen doing it was more powerful than every press headline that came before. That night, during a group session, Regina finally spoke. Her voice was cracked but steady. She said she hadn't spoken to her kids in over a year, said her eldest had told her to stop pretending she had anything worth offering, said she had started to believe it. Then she looked up at me and said, "But not anymore." And in that moment, I realized something deep. This was not a second act. This was not redemption. This was reclamation, a quiet, unstoppable claiming of space that had always been mine. From that week forward, we began documenting stories from the women who came to the center, not for publicity, for preservation. Their words, their truths, their grit, their laughter. We called it the living archive, not to be shown, but to be kept. In a world that moves so fast to forget women once they turn invisible, we were choosing to remember each other in full color. And that, more than anything, became the legacy I was finally proud to build. The letter arrived in a manila envelope without a return address. It was hand-delivered to the front desk of Stand and Still by someone who didn't leave a name, just nodded once and disappeared before anyone could ask. Inside, a neatly folded document. No signature. Just a printed letterhead from a downtown law firm and 3 stapled pages beneath it. I didn't recognize the firm's name, but I knew the format. It was a cease and desist. I sat in my office with the window open. The sea breeze was unusually warm for late spring. I read the letter twice, slowly. It accused Stand and Still of using personal family stories and private financial information for the purpose of defamation and public humiliation. The words were carefully chosen, vague, but heavy. The kind written by a man who wanted to scare, not sue. The firm was representing Brandon. The gall didn't surprise me, not after all he had done. But what did catch my attention was the final line. It warned that if I continued to make public statements that could be interpreted as damaging to his reputation, he would be forced to pursue legal action and revisit the issue of estate distribution. That last phrase wasn't just a threat, it was a provocation. Brandon was still hoping I would make this a war in public, but he didn't understand. I had already won where it mattered. I didn't need to fight him anymore. I had nothing left to prove. But I did need to protect the women at the center, their stories, their safety. So I picked up the phone and called a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Marisol Rothwell. Back when I was still in the service, Marisol had been one of the few lawyers assigned to the Veterans Transition Unit who actually listened. She was sharp, unshaken, and had a laugh that could disarm a colonel. She picked up on the second ring. After I explained the situation, she said she'd meet me that evening. She drove up from the city herself. No staff, no billable hours mentioned, just a leather briefcase and her old combat boots. We sat across from each other at the small table in the back room of the center. I handed her the letter. She read it in silence. Then she looked up, eyes steady, and said, "They're bluffing." She explained how the wording was intentionally weak. No direct claims, no admission of harm. It was a scare tactic, nothing more. Still, she said, we'd respond. Not with defense, with clarity. By morning, she had drafted a reply. It was calm, professional, and devastatingly precise. It affirmed that no personal names had been used in any official communication. It confirmed that all financial documentation connected to the foundation was fully transparent and compliant. And it reminded them, gently, that any further attempt to threaten or intimidate the staff or volunteers of a non-profit working with trauma survivors would be documented and pursued as harassment. We sent the letter, certified mail. No further reply came. But the silence felt loud. 3 days later, I got a call from a producer at a national broadcast outlet. A feature story. They wanted to spotlight the foundation. They had seen the regional news piece and wanted to dive deeper. Normally, I would have said no. I wasn't hungry for attention. But something shifted in me. I remembered the silence that used to follow my son's outbursts. The way I used to fold into myself and apologize, even when I had done nothing wrong. The way my voice would shake around people with power. That silence had cost me years. So I said yes. They sent a small team, camera, microphones, a soft-spoken interviewer who didn't push, just asked to hear the truth. I told them about Stand and Still. I told them about the women who found their way here. I told them about my time in the military, the injury, the surgery, the rejection, the aftermath. I didn't name names, but I named pain. I named dignity. I named recovery. The segment aired on a Friday evening, prime time, right after the local news. And in the final minute of the story, they mentioned a small detail from public records, that the founder of Stand and Still had redirected her entitled veteran benefits and housing stipends into a publicly registered community trust. Total value, $8.8 million. That detail was factual and intentional. Because that night, Brandon's silence ended. He showed up at my house, not alone. He brought a lawyer, a different one this time. Younger, eager. They stood outside the front gate, trying to look official. I didn't come out, but I had the camera system running, the one I had installed after the last incident. Their voices were recorded, demanding, entitled. My assistant forwarded the footage to Marisol. She sent one letter. This time it wasn't vague. It formally barred Brandon and any legal representative of his from contacting me directly or entering the property without prior consent. Any future attempts would be considered trespassing and met with formal charges. 3 days later, a formal apology arrived. Not from Brandon. From the firm. They had dropped him. The official reason was conflict of interest. But I knew he had become a liability, a man who had tried to silence the one woman who no longer needed him. I kept that letter too, not as a trophy, as proof that there are consequences for choosing cruelty, even if they arrive slowly. even if they come dressed in paper instead of rage. And for the first time since my surgery, I slept through the night. No startles, no dreams, just the sound of the tide, steady against the shore. When the letter from the law firm arrived, I knew it was over for him in the courtroom. But there was still something unfinished in me. It wasn't just about shutting him out legally. I needed to face him. Not for closure, not for forgiveness. I needed him to look me in the eye and see the version of me that he could no longer manipulate, the one who had come back from the battlefield, the one who had survived surgery, betrayal, abandonment, the one who had built a legacy without him. So I made the call myself, not to Brandon, but to his wife. Samantha answered on the second ring, voice clipped and cold like she had been rehearsing detachment for weeks. I didn't explain much. I simply said, "There are papers left at the house. His name is still on one of the storage units. He might want to pick them up before the lease expires." She paused, then said she'd send him that weekend. He came alone, Saturday morning, late. The sun was already high, and I had left the front gate open, just for him. I waited in the backyard, where the garden met the cliff's edge, overlooking the wide, quiet stretch of coastline I had learned to call my sanctuary. When he came through the back door, he didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting for me to break the silence. But I didn't. He was the one who had to speak this time, and he did. "So this is what it's come to," he said, voice low and bitter. "You really had to drag all this out in public." I didn't flinch. He kept going. "Do you think this makes you strong, humiliating your own son, turning the press into your personal revenge tool?" I turned toward him slowly. "You humiliated yourself, Brandon." I said it calmly. No anger, no trembling. You wanted people to see me weak. You wanted to erase me from the picture because my injuries made you uncomfortable. You didn't expect me to survive. You didn't expect me to rise. His face twitched at that, like I had touched a nerve he didn't know was exposed. I walked a few steps toward him. No rush. Just the steady pace of someone walking through the fire without burning anymore. "You said you didn't have the capacity to take care of me. You said you had no room in your life for a broken old woman. But what you really meant was, you had no room for a woman who could no longer be used." He opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to hear excuses. I just want you to see this place one last time, because after today, you'll never step foot on this land again." He frowned. I continued. "You remember the guest house in the back? The one you always said would be your retirement space. I converted it into transitional housing for women coming out of abusive family situations. The lease is signed. Renovation starts next week." He looked like he'd been slapped, not because of the property, but because of the idea, the principle. And that's not all. I pointed at the foundation's ledger, which I had printed and laid out on the patio table. "You used to mock me for spending money on therapy groups, said it was a waste, said no one wants to hear sad stories from old women. Well, Brandon, now they do. Because those stories built this place. Those stories funded new job programs, built confidence, gave a voice to women you never saw as people." His hands clenched into fists. "You never saw me either." "Not really. I was just a mother on a schedule to you. A paycheck, a nurse, a placeholder. But not anymore." I stepped closer. Not threatening, just final. I changed my will. His face drained of color. I donated everything. The land, the assets, the trust, the house, even the royalties from my military memoirs. All of it. Gone from your reach. Not to punish you, to protect myself, because I will never again be in a position where my survival depends on the mercy of someone who sees me as disposable. He stared at me, shaking slightly. I could see the words building behind his eyes, but he didn't speak them. He turned and left. No outburst, no fight, just silence. And it was the most honest thing he had ever given me. As I watched him walk away, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clean, like I had finally scrubbed the last layer of shame from my skin. I sat down on the bench near the edge of the cliff and let the wind move through my hair. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted. I felt present, alive, whole. Later that day, I called Judith. I told her the confrontation was done, that he wouldn't be back. She didn't say much, just told me to rest, said I had earned it. That night, I lit a candle in the hallway for the women who had passed through standing still in silence, for the ones who never got to have their moment. And then I whispered their names, one by one, because silence may protect the abuser, but truth protects the soul, and I would never go silent again. The Sunday morning after Brandon walked out of my garden was unusually still. The wind that normally hummed through the tall eucalyptus stood silent. Even the ocean seemed hushed, as if the entire coastline knew something had shifted. I hadn't touched the phone all night, but when I picked it up just after breakfast, it was humming like a live wire. 43 missed calls. Most were from numbers I didn't recognize. A few were from local newsrooms. One was from the foundation's PR manager, Lauren. Her message was short: "It's out." By the time I clicked open the first headline, the story had already gone national. Elderly woman denied care by son. Becomes symbol of resilience. Another one. She donated $8.8 million and a coastal estate. After being abandoned post-surgery. CBS New York had run the segment first. A well-edited piece with voiceovers, archival photos, and yes, a small portion of the video from the day I was left at the hospital. I hadn't planned on giving them that footage, but Judith had sent it. She had asked my permission, but before I could even weigh the idea, she'd said, "Evelyn, they need to see what it looks like, what cruelty sounds like when it wears the voice of family." And they did. The clip was barely 10 seconds long, just enough to show the nurse walking me down in the wheelchair, just enough to catch Brandon's voice saying, "We don't have the space for this right now," just enough to show the moment I was wheeled back inside. 10 seconds. That was all. And the world exploded. By noon, major outlets were replaying the story. Online forums lit up. Reddit threads climbed to the front page. Women posted stories of being neglected by their children. Nurses chimed in with their own heartbreaks. Trauma therapists linked articles. Activists offered interviews. And amid it all, a slow unraveling began. It started with Samantha's business. Her boutique PR firm had built its brand on family-centered campaigns and ethics-first partnerships. She had given a TEDx talk 2 years ago titled "Caring for Our Elders in a Digital Age." The irony was too sharp for the public to ignore. Clients pulled out within hours. Her name was removed from the firm's website the same afternoon. That evening, the Foundation's General Counsel forwarded me a formal letter from the State Ethics Board. Apparently, Samantha had listed me on some internal forms as a family beneficiary to secure marketing tax credits. The implication, misrepresentation for financial benefit. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just closed the email and sat with my hands folded in my lap. Brandon's fallout came slower. He wasn't active online. He had no personal brand to damage. But the consequences found him anyway. 3 of his former colleagues from the real estate development group came forward, anonymously at first, alleging that he had used my name and credit score to float bridge loans for one of his stalled property projects. I had no idea. But the bank statements didn't lie. There were temporary authorizations tied to an old joint account I had long stopped using, but never officially closed. By midweek, a federal inquiry was opened into the legitimacy of those funds. And just like that, the story took another turn. This time, the headlines read, "From Abandonment to Fraud: How One Woman's Quiet Justice Exposed Family Secrets." I barely recognized my own life. Strangers mailed me letters, handmade cards, knitted scarves. A woman from Minnesota sent me a journal with a note inside that said, "You helped me leave my daughter's house. I didn't know I had the right." Through all of it, I kept moving slowly. I kept drinking my morning coffee with cinnamon. I still walked down to the shore at sunset. I still answered every letter by hand, even if it took me until midnight. But beneath that calm, there was something new blooming in my chest. A quiet certainty that telling the truth, even in 10 seconds, could turn the tide of silence into a wave of reckoning. By the second week, the Attorney General's office contacted me for an official statement. Not just about the financial misconduct, but about emotional elder abuse. It had been years since anyone used the word abuse in my context. People usually saved that word for bruises, for screams. But neglect was abuse. Silence was abuse. Being discarded after surgery was abuse. So I gave them my statement. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I simply told them what happened, what was said, what was not said, and what I had to do in order to survive. Then I handed over the folder I had once carried to Brandon's house, the one with the documentation, the bank traces, the notarized letters, and I walked home without a single tremble in my step. That night, Lauren called again. She said we had been nominated for the National Women's Resilience Honor. I told her I wasn't interested in walking stages or posing for photographs. She understood. Then she asked if she could include my story in a special publication about financial and emotional elder empowerment. I paused, then said yes. But only if we used other voices too, the ones who didn't get headlines, the ones who had disappeared in silence. Because my story was never just mine. It was the story of 1,000 quiet mothers. The story of women who had cooked meals with hands swollen from arthritis, who had cleaned after grown children too proud to say thank you, who had been called too much, too old, too tired, only to rise again and still stand. The letter arrived without ceremony, no return address, no embellishments, just a plain white envelope that looked like any piece of forgotten mail. But the moment I held it in my hand, I knew it was from him. Brandon's handwriting was unmistakable, tight, sharp, the kind of script that always looked like it was written under pressure, like someone always trying to prove a point. Inside, there was a single line, written dead center on a blank page. "You win. No apology, no explanation, not even his name." For a moment, I stood on the porch with the letter open in my hand, letting the cold coastal wind pull at my sleeves as seagulls circled far above, and I realized that those 2 words were more honest than anything he had ever said to me before. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, but I knew what the letter meant. It meant he would come. That Friday, just past 3 in the afternoon, his car appeared at the edge of the gravel drive, the same one he used to race down when he came home from college, when he still called this place home. This time, he parked further away, not daring to cross the invisible threshold, as if the house no longer welcomed him. And maybe it didn't. He stepped out slowly. No Samantha beside him. No frantic energy, no false charm. Just a man walking up the porch with the weight of a ruined legacy pressing down on his shoulders. I didn't greet him with words. I didn't need to. He knew why he was here, and so did I. He stood still for a long time, looking at me, not with defiance, not with sorrow, but with something far more hollow, resignation. Then he spoke, and his voice, though low, carried an edge of disbelief that felt like he was only now understanding the truth. He said he didn't come to ask for forgiveness, that he knew it was no longer his to request. He said he didn't expect me to say anything at all, so I didn't. I just turned and opened the door to the house that I had taken back, the one he once tried to claim through manipulation and betrayal. He walked in with a hesitance I had never seen in him, like every piece of furniture was unfamiliar, every photo on the wall a stranger's memory. He glanced toward the mantel where the painting now hung, the one Judith had sent me after the CBS interview aired. It was a lighthouse standing firm on a cliff, battered by relentless waves. He didn't say anything about it. Instead, he remained in the center of the room, hands loose at his sides, as if even folding his arms might feel like a defense he no longer had a right to use. Then he said the words that stopped me cold. He told me that I was not the woman he thought I was, that all his life he had painted me as too quiet, too soft, too willing to be overlooked, that he had needed that image to justify what he had done, to rationalize abandoning me at the hospital, draining my accounts, smiling at me through years of deception. But I wasn't weak, he said. I had never been. I was simply waiting. He asked then, in a flat voice, whether I had changed the will. I looked at him directly and told him yes, that the day I returned from the hospital, I had done what I should have done years ago. I removed his name. His reaction was muted, as if part of him had already known. Then he asked who it would go to now. I told him I had set up a foundation for elder justice, legal aid, housing support, and trauma recovery for women who had suffered in silence the way I once had. There was no outburst, no denial, no bargaining. He just nodded once, slow and heavy, the way a person accepts the final nail in a coffin they built themselves. I asked him why, not because I needed closure, but because I wanted him to say it aloud, to hear himself admit it. Why had he left me there, broken and helpless? Why did he let me believe I was loved when he had planned to strip me of everything? He didn't try to lie. He said only this, because I thought you'd never fight back. That, more than anything, told me who he had become. A man who took advantage not because he was desperate, but because he could. Because he thought I wouldn't stop him. He said he had left Samantha, that the company had collapsed, that he was living in a one-bedroom apartment he couldn't afford, that he didn't recognize himself anymore. I told him very simply that it was no longer my concern. He asked to see the garden. I let him. He walked through it in silence, brushing his fingers along the rosemary and thyme, pausing by the old bench where he used to read as a boy. He stood for a long time by the bird bath. When he came back, he didn't look redeemed. He didn't even look sorry. But he looked real. For once, unarmored. He said goodbye without reaching for a hug. I didn't offer one. And as he walked back to his car, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clarity. That night, I lit a single candle and sat in the kitchen, drinking tea, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket stitched from everything I had survived. I thought of all the women who had been cast aside, made invisible, turned into cautionary tales or burdens. And I knew I wasn't just living for myself anymore. I was living proof that survival wasn't enough. You had to rise, you had to reclaim, and you had to remember. Because even if the world forgets you, you must never forget who you are. The crowd at the ceremony had thinned by the time I stepped down from the stage, but the moment still felt immense. My hands were still slightly trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming release of everything I had carried alone for so long. The applause, the lights, the honor, it all faded into a soft hum as I walked through the side exit of the building and out into the open air. The sky was beginning to turn gold just before sunset. For once, I felt no need to rush, no need to prove anything. I had done what I came to do. Across the lawn, I spotted April waiting near the van. She had a quiet, steady smile on her face. When our eyes met, there was no need for words. She had been beside me in the dark when no one else would stand there. Her presence now, in the light, was the only reassurance I needed. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room of my beach house. The breeze from the ocean slipped through the open windows, and the air smelled like salt and eucalyptus. On the coffee table sat the framed photo from earlier that day, me in uniform, medal pinned neatly to my chest, hand over heart. I let the silence fill the room. In that silence, I saw the chapters that had come before, the surgery room lights, the backseat rejection from my children, the cruel signatures they scribbled on the refusal forms. I saw the messages left unanswered, the meals skipped, the wheelchairs left untouched in waiting rooms. I saw the night I decided I would no longer ask for kindness. I would build my own justice. And I did. They lost everything trying to squeeze me out. The lawsuit settled, the press firestorm still circling, the sponsors that backed out from their startups, the homes seized under scrutiny. None of that brought me joy. But it did bring balance, a reset, a mirror held up to what they had become. Earlier that morning, before the ceremony, someone had slipped an envelope under my door. Inside was a letter from Kayla. She wrote about grief, about panic, about how they were never prepared to handle someone like me, strong, persistent, unbreakable. She said they wanted to forget the strength I used to raise them, said it made them feel small. Her words were heavy, but they did not bend me, because I had changed. That morning, I finalized a fund in my name, the Colonel Grace Fund. A portion of the veteran settlement, a share of the media licensing rights, and a large chunk of my late husband's untouched savings were redirected into it. The fund would support older women leaving toxic households, especially mothers like me. Women who had given everything and were left with nothing. Women who needed a second chance, not just survival. I did not build it to make a statement. I built it so the pain would not go to waste. That evening, I received a voicemail from Martin. He had kept quiet through it all, but his voice shook with quiet pride. He told me that I had changed something, not just for myself, but for others watching. Said I had reminded people that being a mother was not a role to be discarded like a coat. It was a history, a legacy, a force. And now I live quietly, not invisibly, not timidly, just quietly. I wake early, walk the shoreline, make tea, read history books. I attend fund meetings every other Wednesday. I still wear the ring my husband gave me. But now I also wear my own name, Colonel Grace Whitlow. They tried to erase me, and all they did was give me a bigger canvas. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, I hope you'll take a moment to think about the women around you, the ones who gave without asking, who stayed quiet too long, who are finally ready to reclaim their place. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell someone you trust what this made you feel. Every voice matters, yours too.